I'll say that Nick Cook was going to introduce this morning, but he got sick. So I'm stepping in, and I actually am really happy to be doing that because this story started for me about 2022 in the midst of the pandemic, when I read a New York Times Magazine article about some folks remaking the LA River. And it was about, as you'll learn, the LA River is this concrete canal through a big city. And the article talked about remaking the river and the community in a really integrated way. And so I think it was a community first approach, and it just got me really excited about the work we're doing, and in a particularly challenging environment where there are a lot of people, there's a lot of infrastructure, and there's a lot of history with the community and inequities, and a lot of the stuff we talk about. So it's a wonderful example to learn from, and with that, I'll introduce Laurie Olin and Jessica Henson. Laurie is a landscape architect and winner of the Presidential Medal of the Arts, awarded by President Obama in 2012. He started his firm in 1976, and over the past nearly 50 years has helped design the National Mall to Battery City Park, some of the most globally significant parks and open spaces. Jessica is a partner at Olin and leads the LA office. She teaches at University of Southern California and works on projects that combines social and environmental resilience. Jessica grew up in rural Illinois along the Mississippi and really loves rivers. They wanted me to convey a few framing facts. One, and I think it just highlights, of course, that rivers are important to people. People are important to rivers. More than 50% of the world's population lives in floodplains and coastal areas. 50% of us live within 3 kilometers of fresh water, and only 10% of the world's population lives more than 10 kilometers from fresh water. So we'll talk about making those connections and the importance of those. So excited to introduce Laurie and Jessica. Thank you.
Oh boy. Well, thanks, Nick, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. It's kind of happy, surprised to be invited. So I'm going to try and very briefly explain why a firm like us might happen to be here at a conference of the Northwest folks about river and river restoration. So push the button. The first slide, please. There we go. Okay, so for part of our, the reason to be here is when I was a child, rivers were very important. Where I grew up in Alaska, they were still used for commerce and transportation. That's me when I was in 8th grade, doing drawings of some of the stern wheelers and Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory. Down below is a photo of the MRR tied up in front of a street light after a flood caused by an ice jam when I was in 4th grade, in Fairbanks. And so we kind of grew up with the rivers. I was on the Chena River, which leads to the Tanana, which leads to the Yukon, which leads to the Bering Sea, which leads to the Pacific Ocean, right? Everything's connected. And rivers were a source of commerce and a source of food and a source of fun. We had Dolly Varden, we had, grayling, we had Arctic char, we had, great northern pike, we had rainbow trout, and of course we had salmon. And you can see some of them up there drying because we used them for dog food in the winters out on the Bering Sea, where the Bristol Bay still has the largest salmon pack in the world. So I kind of grew up with this stuff, but kind of like Thoreau, I kind of left the forest and the woods and came into town. And actually to the city and many cities. First there was Anchorage, then there was Seattle, then there was New York, then there was London, then there was Rome, then there was Boston, and then Philadelphia 50 years ago, where I still live. That's Philadelphia on a river, one of 2 rivers it's on. Like Boston, it's on 2 rivers. So our work has largely had a lot to do with what you'd call urban stuff, but we've had the lucky opportunity to do a few things that you would recognize, like this trout stream is for cutthroat trout that I rebuilt up in the Rockies near Mount Sopris. It's a nice it's now fast water with, pools and riffles and some, shaded cold water. But I also produced this with a hydrologist from Idaho, this nice wetland for elk and bear and stuff that in an area that has real water problems. So this is heavily used by the animals of that area now. So we've had some fun, but basically we've done a lot more in cities because the problem is most of these cities are all on rivers. And some of the rivers are pretty dangerous or pretty polluted, or they're tidal, and they're difficult, and the cities turned their back on them 150, 200 years ago, and trying to get the waterfront back has been a big problem in all these cities. So that was new. I'll just back up 1 second. That's Battery Park City. It was a landfill in the Hudson River. It's 98 acres. It would be illegal today. It's part of the Lower Manhattan Plan of Wallace, McHarg, Roberts, and Todd. And what you see there is basically a flat piece of landfill that we did a plan with some friends for part of the city. And it's very ordinary stuff. It's streets and buildings. But I managed to talk them into taking the entire perimeter, and this is in 1979, and putting it into pedestrian access and use. And so there's this mile-long walk along the river that was the beginning of the reclamation of the waterfront in New York City. And it's still going on in Brooklyn with our friends there. And it's about to go on in the Bronx. But it's been since then trying to get people back to the river and have them step out of the city into the space of the Hudson to see what's going on, where they are on the planet, the time of day, the cycles of life, fresh air, and all that. Well, anyway, we've done that elsewhere, but we've also had some opportunities while doing large-scale urban development projects. This is Mission Bay in San Francisco. No, excuse me, I'm ahead of myself. There was an ad hoc commission for the National Park Service to try and figure out how to do a plan for a presidio and a lot of military facilities that are around the Bay Area, just north of San Francisco. And so in one of the first sessions, I did this doodle in my sketchbook that I thought it'd be kind of cool if they could rip up the Crissy Field, the military air base, and if they could turn it back into the estuary that it once was. Because people forget the San Francisco Bay is the estuary of the Sacramento River. And so I thought, if they could just have fresh, a little bit of estuary marsh and dunes and stuff, and we didn't have the good fortune to execute it, another firm did, but it happened, just kind of like my sketch there. So the notion that in the middle of these big cities, like this is the outfall of Mission Creek at Mission Bay, where we did another plan for urban development. And again, I said, make the entire perimeter accessible to pedestrians. And then even though one side we wanted to retain some of the historic wharfs and stuff, the other side you could actually make safe for people to get down to and see the real water, the tide coming and going, the plants. And so we managed to do this under all kinds of, as you know, difficult circumstances. But there it is. And again, another firm got to do this piece after we managed to get the plan done. But that's okay. We're getting the right thing done. So on another 1,000-acre site in Los Angeles, a lot of urban development, and then I had this brainstorm, as you see in that early doodle in the upper right, that maybe there should be a marsh, and that maybe what should happen is we should take all the drainage from the area and put it out there and kind of clean it up before it got back into Santa Monica Bay. So lo and behold, after the usual economic hassles and the political debates for the next decade or so, we actually produced the Bellona wetlands, which is really a quite wonderful place for migratory birds and residential birds and mammals and fish and all that sort of stuff that you all know so much about, that we all care about. But basically, we have, despite our urban reputation and our hardcore urban development stuff, here's Mill Creek, Mill River in Stamford, Connecticut, our partner did, where the usual taking down a low-head dam and reducing the flooded area to the actual original river basin, the corridor of the river that it should have been, with the usual stuff, getting rid of all the pollutants. And there it is afterwards. The idea that people can actually get to the water, and when they get to the water, it's clean and fresh and it's safe. You know, the fact that we are, how to say, we're animals, right? And we evolved in nature. And Olmsted's right, nature's good for you. So getting kids, the educational aspect of water in the cities is something we feel very strongly about. How to do that. So it's human ecology is sort of what's been driving us for quite a while. Even our latest project, Lower Manhattan, where Cindy Sanders, one of our partners, managed to take an old pier, turn it into a park with recreation and the usual stuff. It also has a transect from upland plants and habitats down through the riparian stuff, and it gets down to the dune grasses and shore grasses and some little tide pools that we built that people can go and actually see tide pools full of creatures right there in Manhattan next to Wall Street. So the notion that you can bring this stuff to the city somehow and use it for education strikes us as being extremely important. On that emotional note, I will turn it over to Jessica, who's going to tell you about this other complicated project.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you to all of you. It's been such a delight to meet so many of you over the last couple of days, and I'm just in awe of all of the work that all of you are doing and the partnerships with many of you we already have and the continuation of those into the future. As Laurie said, we're very interested in this question of how do you bring nature and the environment into the city, and Los Angeles is a very complicated case study because although we get about 15 inches of rain a year, we are unfortunate in that it comes in a few large rain events all in the same couple of months. And so most of the time, Los Angeles River doesn't have a lot of water in it, a little bit of groundwater and urban drool coming off of car washing. There that you see on the left is what the Los Angeles River, as Nick mentioned, in concrete looks like most of the time. And then about less than 1% of the time, all of the runoff from this very steep and flashy watershed collects in this river and wreaks havoc for 24 to 72 hours, unfortunately, often causing deaths, people getting caught in swift water, and the stories that you have read. This river is very urban. Over 1 million people live within just 1 mile. A third of Californians, so 10 to 12 million people, live within an hour drive. And so the complications, when you combine that with a river that is also carrying a cubic feet per second comparable to the water going over Niagara Falls at downtown Los Angeles when there is a large rainstorm, it's a little complex, like Laurie was mentioning in some of these situations. So if you don't know the LA River well, it's only 51 miles long, which compared to some of the rivers we've been talking about the last couple of days is quite short, but it's one of the most famous and iconic rivers in the world. You've seen it in Greece in the Terminator. It starts on the west side of the San Fernando Valley, flows pretty much due east. It takes a sharp turn south, flows through downtown LA, and then out to the Pacific Ocean at Long Beach. Drains about 830 square miles of very different types of terrain, as you'll see. And you'll hear the story today of how we got involved. As you all know, there's a lot of different jurisdictions. Many of you work in those sort of environments. Different federal and county agencies maintain different sections of the river, and also about 17 different cities that have land use jurisdiction as well as even own different parts of the channel. And it's not all the same. So you see one image in a lot of the movies, but the 51 miles actually vary from smaller sections to sections that have soft bottom and earthen bottoms to an estuary at Long Beach. So there's not something that works for all 51 miles. There's no 51-mile solution. About 10, 11 years ago, Laurie, myself, and some others started working with a group of ecologists, engineers, architects, to think about how to catalyze work along the Los Angeles River a little bit more quickly. So the river came into the popular imagination in the 80s. There's been some really great work that has been done, but projects haven't moved as fast as we'd like. And so we said, we got to get to the bottom of the hydrology and the hydraulics here before we can do another design plan, and reviewed over 140 different plans that had something to say about the river. We started, of course, wanting to green the river, and in some of those early days back in 2014, did some capacity analyses of what could we do, what could we do? Something as simple as planting the banks reduces that capacity by like 50%. So it's a real challenge of how we might start to think about this without affecting humans too. So that started, and we also started looking at other factors. So the environmental burden map that you see here in front of you, in the darkest red, shows people living in some of the worst environmental conditions in the entire state of California. And so when you combine the fact that this river, which has often been seen as a backyard, and the fact that some of those communities are burdened, historically underserved, presently underserved, and greatly disadvantaged, there's a great need. We also dug into a lot of different histories around this, even the Olmsted-Bartholomew Plan from the 1930s, which proposed a greenway along the LA River, which unfortunately never happened. And what could we do today? Could we make it a park? Could we make this a 51-mile park? So that's started us thinking like, oh, how does this compare to other large parks around the country and the world? And you can see when you compare it to some other places, it's kind of big. It's a little daunting. But when you look at the Los Angeles River compared to some of the infrastructure work that the state of California or other places in the country have done in the past century, the LA River as a project is quite possible. We can reimagine this river. We've worked at this scale, and we can do it. With over 3 years of community engagement started to come together after some of those initial efforts, the county started the LA River Master Plan to reimagine it. And we reached over 1 million people in this process during this, whether in person or digitally, to understand what communities needed, and got a lot of data together. It's sort of funny to stand up here in 2025 and talk about how 10 or 15 years ago the idea of a 51-mile database of the river sounded so far in the future, and now I stand here and I say, it sounds so far in the past. We've come so far to bring so much together, not just us, but other collaborators as well. But it wasn't just about the hydrology and the ecology and the hydraulics of the river channel, because people around the river living in communities have great need. And one of the biggest things in LA County is related to housing, massive housing shortage of over 500,000 units, and significant pressures around urban displacement, people that can no longer afford to live in their neighborhoods. So changes along the river, as in a positive way, which we all think is great, can have a really negative effect on people's day-to-day livelihood. And so we had to come up with ways to bring together not only the hydraulics, the hydrology, the biology, but with the housing, with the education, with fostering opportunities for workforce development, and healthy, supportive ecosystems meet opportunities for arts, culture, education, and work. As well as, could we conserve a little bit more of this water like it used to when it would rain historically? So the reimagined river imagines a 51-mile connected public open space woven together with neighboring communities. Just for a little side note on the LA River, for those of you that might not know it very well, it drops 780 feet in just that 51 miles, which is more elevation change than the Mississippi makes from Minneapolis to New Orleans. So it's moving along this channel. It's a high-speed channel, high-speed concrete channel, and it makes its headwaters and its tributaries in the mountains of the San Gabriels, which are quite tall peaks at 7,000 feet. And that water runs really quickly off the mountains, creating a very quick moving series of water. Historically, we know that indigenous tribes actually worked in concert with that, and how the villages would move and work when the river would swell. You can see here the blue where the river historically flooded, and how the river moved around in the delta, even sometimes combining with the San Gabriel River, which is over here on the right. Sometimes it flowed out through Bayona Creek. Laurie mentioned Playa Vista and the Bayona wetlands before, and so it moved its channel around, and that was okay when there were when we don't think of what's there today. And there was a really rich series of wetlands that were along a lot of these tributaries, especially the Big Tahunga Wash. And that helped slow down water and helped recharge a whole series of really amazing groundwater aquifers that were in this area. As humans got closer and closer to that floodplain and developed Los Angeles, a series of floods, especially heavy ones in the early 1900s, really surprised people. They were like, whoa, what is this? It was dry and now it's wet, and we all know that this sort of story of the Los Angeles River getting out of its banks early, there had been some efforts at channelization and some efforts at levees, but by the 1930s, the federal government said, Los Angeles, you don't know what you're doing. We're sending in the Army Corps of Engineers to channelize this river and keep people safe and our defense industry safe during the eve of World War II. So to look at how that has changed over the decades, if you look at this chart, and this is I know a very detailed chart, but I'll try to explain it to you. The green line is the 30s to the 50s. The yellow is the 60s to the 80s, or excuse me, the 50s to the 60s, and then the peach line is the 60s up through the 80s. And what has happened in LA, as you can see on the diagram here, is in the small rain events, because of the amount of urbanization we now have, our time of concentration and the amount of water running off has significantly changed. Like in a smaller rainstorm, a 20-year event or something like that, we have a lot more runoff than we should. So we need projects to slow that water down. We need water quality, BMPs, all these things to slow water down, especially in the small events. But the funniest thing happens as you start to move towards the largest storms, like the 1% event, the one that's on that column. They all start to converge. And that's because historically and today, at a certain point, all of the pores fill up in the soil and water is still running off of those very steep mountains. And so there is a need to still, in those biggest storms, move a lot of water in LA, which as a designer is unfortunate for me because I just want like the small, very polite storms that come through that are very nice to my landscapes. So about 20% of the channel already doesn't meet a 1% flood. Obviously, FEMA and the Army Corps don't love that, and they're looking at different risks. And we know in some of the modeling that we and our colleagues have looked at that with climate instability and change, this is getting actually worse. So what do you do? In all of those plans that we reviewed as we were coming into the master plan effort, there are two sort of underlying ideas that formed a lot of the work, which are interesting ideas, but are somewhat flawed. One was a sheer just like, let's widen the 51-mile river. And the other was, can we increase watershed permeability and storage? So widening the river, a study that was done in 2007 before our time for the City of Los Angeles Revitalization Master Plan noted that to do that, you'd need approximately 5 times the width of the channel as it exists today. And you would need to displace some of the math that we were looking at. You'd need to displace on the order of 70,000 to 100,000 residents to do that. The very unfortunate thing about that is a lot of those residents are already living in some of the poorest and most historically disadvantaged and impacted communities that have been redlined, communities that have been repeatedly displaced and disenfranchised. So we said, we can do better than that. The other idea, which is, can we make the watershed more sponge-like, which is a great idea. We should absolutely do that, especially in the smaller storm events. It helps with water quality. It helps slow down those flows. It helps recharge our aquifers. But in those big storms, these are some differences in the hydrographs, even a 50% reduction in the permeability of the watershed, which that would be legendary to hit a 50% reduction in the watershed of LA. It barely changes the peak flows of the hydrograph. As you can see here, it's almost impossible. So we said, that's what Laurie would say, we have to figure out a different way to do this. And so in the LA River Master Plan, we're really trying to bring together people and ecology in creative ways in an urban environment that still do all the good things that we know and love, but don't have a negative impact on people. One of the first things was trying to figure out how to get people to talk about that data. So we came up with this system of the LA River Ruler, which is a linear sort of DNA strand of the river, which allowed us to take different data sets from all different, like the social sciences, the engineering sciences, the architectural planning sciences, and pull them together into single data sets that you could quickly help community members see where they were along the river and how their needs related to other neighborhoods and how they might overlap. And so this was really helpful to start having those conversations. Behind the scenes, we did this with a little over 200 different types of data that we were collecting, but also through the engagement process, but also other data sets to be able to come to how could we prioritize needs in communities based on the goals that we had heard from the communities and made with them. And so these suitability analyses really help this county prioritize projects and prioritize those needs. As you zoom into those goals, which I'm not going to take you through all of the detail of this, but just to give you one example, one of our really exciting moments is under Goal 1, which is about flood risk and resiliency. One of the methods, this is the first time in an LA County flood control district, flood document for the LA River to prioritize natural features and processes for flood risk reduction, which we were obviously very excited. So each of these goals went down into actions and methods to help reimagine the river. And then became this question of how to locate new projects. So we overlapped those needs with different opportunity spaces, lots of look at ownership, who could be involved, and a more equitable cadence along the river because some neighborhoods have been left out. This led to a whole series of small, medium, large, extra large, different types of projects that would all be connected by this elegant path network along the 51 miles. And a series of what we would call a kit of parts of different strategies. As I mentioned before, 51 miles, not everything works the same everywhere. In some places, the concrete channel will probably continue to be there for many decades to come, if not the next century. But there are other places where we can reclaim floodplain, or we can create bridges and connect schools and other entities, or we can help soften the impact of the channel with some diversions through soft beds or other elements like that. And we linked each of those to biodiversity profiles that could help support endemic and native species of the Los Angeles region, leading to a series of ecological hotspots that would create opportunities for wildlife to migrate and to be able to move more freely along this river and into the mountains around the city. And a lot of those species, many of you might know some of them, but they're very charismatic, some of them as big as our mountain lions, but down to the smallest frog, like that live along the river here. And so lastly, on the master plan, projects basically fall into two categories. They can either be site-based, many of us are familiar with a typical individual site project, or system-based. And I wanted to highlight a couple of the system-based ones that I think are going to be very interesting for this group. So one of the projects is water capture in the groundwater basins. So the river flows when it rains hard, and it also, in all these different scales of storms. And we have these amazing groundwater basins under the LA River and LA region. So how do we get more of that water when it's raining into those basins? And so this project brings together sites and efforts along the entire 51 miles and across the watershed to reduce the need for water imports by 14% annually. Another example of a system-based project is related to how do we start to restore different sections of the river. You may have guessed that given this urban river condition, a lot of the zones have a lot of invasive species in them that aren't great habitat for our native species. At the same time, we have a lot of other species that are using that non-native vegetation. So how do we come up with strategies that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Flood Control District can use without just clear-cutting different sections of the channel, but still managing those invasive species? So bringing all of these different goals together across that 51 miles, it creates this iconic yet sensitive to the neighborhood's approach that each different neighborhood, based on its needs, can help develop this becomes a toolkit for communities to engage in what they need and what they want along the river. So as we start to wrap up, I'll just give a couple of examples of projects that are now underway based on the overall master plan. The first piece here is at the headwaters of the Los Angeles River, so we're on the very far western side of the San Fernando Valley, and where Arroyo Calabasas and Bell Creek come together to form the river. And at this zone, this is looking at how do we take all of these pieces and parts of the kit of parts that I just showed and deploy them across a couple of miles of the Los Angeles River here. And the first project, I'm happy to say, is actually just got its, I think, 27th permit or something like that. Definitely a lot of different regulation organizations, but hopefully starting construction in just a few months, is this first LA River Pavilion. And this is a site where people can access the river. As Laurie mentioned, we're very interested in how do we bring people back to the river. The LA River has long been the back door, or considered the backyard of the city. And so here, people can come, they can see native vegetation, we have stormwater features, and then they can also access the beginning of the Los Angeles River bike path. The mural that is above, which is a woven tapestry, reflects the San Fernando Valley before development, and the river that is hybridized in there. It's based on historic imagery. So we're very excited to see this piece come together. Obviously, as everyone in this room knows, these projects take many years. Another one that we started working with the city of Los Angeles in 2002 is the Sepulveda Basin. The Sepulveda Basin is a 2,000-acre basin. It's the only location of a dam along the main stem. It's around River Mile 40. This dam functions incredibly well today. So as you'll be able to see here, for better or for worse, based on the channelization and the damming here, this basin keeps a lot of people safe when it rains really hard and fills up. It helps to manage the flows in the river and keep downstream communities from flooding. However, that channelized river that you saw has a lot more potential to not only store, in fact, more water, but to really change the habitat value of this large basin. And so what we've been working with the city of Los Angeles over the last 2 years is now a specific concept plan to revitalize this 2 miles of the Los Angeles River, to make it again a river that is moving like it would have historically geomorphologically, and to make it a better space for people to hang out, to bike. And this plan, similar to what Laurie was saying, is bringing together mobility, it's bringing together access, it's bringing together learning and opportunity with this river restoration. We're looking right now, we're starting another series of technical study. We're looking at increasing the flood risk capacity of the basin from 10 to 25%, while also significantly increasing somewhere on the order of 600 to 1,000 acres of habitat improvements in the basin. So we're very excited about some of these projects as they've started to come together. And here you can see just the range of different types of things that are happening in that vision plan, specific things coming together, bringing together a long history of leadership to reimagine the LA River and making this really an iconic place for communities to come together in the decades to come. So we're very excited also to take some questions today. We wanted to leave some extra time. And so please, I will welcome, I think, Nick back up, or do we just come up? Either is fine. Come on up, Laurie.